Welcome to our phenomenal program on Under the Microscope, a close-up look at Chicago's life and lab science sector. The panelists have a lot of fantastic things to say and a lot of positivity at a time when we need it. I'm Lauren Bagel. I'm the president of the Chicago chapter of CoreNet Global, and I'm with All Steel and Gunlock. Thank you for being here. We always go over the Zoom sort of etiquette, if you will. I'm going to flip that slide for me, Patrick. For those of you, we always recommend, for those of you new on here, we recommend you put speaker view on, and then a lot of people often take themselves off screen, and make sure you're on mute, please. We are recording this and it will be available on our website at another, soon after the program airs. We always like to mention that if you have questions, feel free to put those in the chat. We will try to address those at the end of the program. So please do utilize that feature. And then let's flip next. And you know our sponsors, we couldn't do this without them. Thank you for your continued support throughout this pretty difficult year, but we're surviving, we're doing it. And with that being said, next up are another great list of all the programs that we've got coming up. So first thing I'll note, and pretty much we'll make this quick, Monday the 16th is the extended deadline for our Let's Get Real Awards this year. The deadline is the end of the day on Monday. On Thursday, December 10th, we're going to do a virtual tour of Bank of America. On the 14th, we've got another Outlook with Spencer from CBRE. So let's hear what he has to say this time around, 8 months plus into this landscape we're in. And then on the 28th, we're going to have another broker roundtable, kind of catch back up with some of the familiar names from, I don't know how much, 6 months ago or so. So look on our website, be sure to get yourself registered for these great events. And with that being said, I'm going to turn this over to the moderator for the program, Jeff Janicek with Skender Construction.
Well, thanks. I'm Jeff Janicek. I'm with Skender Construction, and I'm going to do my best to look into the camera, I was told, but I have more monitors and notes for this discussion. I feel like we're sending someone into space here with all this technology. Once again, I'm Jeff Janicek. I'm with Vice President. I oversee lab sciences, healthcare, and higher ed here at Skender in Chicago. I've been a contractor for over 30 years. I started dabbling, and I'm going to use the word dabbling in laboratory work back in late 90s. My first introduction to lab work was when everyone thought it was funny to send me, the new kid, around down into a lab down at IIT that I believe had apes in it in a dark room. So that was my introduction. Didn't really start getting serious about this from my healthcare background until my oldest daughter told me she was going to go into biosciences, and I didn't know what it is as a dumb civil engineer. So with that kind of background, we're bringing together a panel of probably the top people in Chicago here right now to talk about the subject and educate us all a little more and where it is. So we're going to start with, and I'm going to have them introduce themselves, but we have John Conrad, President and CEO of iBio, and he's going to explain what iBio is and be a great source of data. We have Dan Lyne, who's Senior Vice President of Global Technology at CBRE. He's quite familiar with the spaces that are available. And then we have John Flavin, who is founder and CEO of Portal Innovations. He's not only leading a charge of development in the West Loop, but he's also a think tank leader, I guess we're going to say it, for where this market needs to go. So with each of that, I'm going to start with John. Can you give me a little background about yourself, and we're going to go there. Sorry, we'll start with John Conrad.
No problem. Yeah, so my name is John Conrad. I'm president and CEO of the Illinois Biotechnology Innovation Organization, also known as iBio. So iBio represents the nearly 88,000 life sciences jobs that we have here in the state of Illinois. We're really focused on building a better kind of community here for our companies to grow, to relocate, and to continue to kind of expand our local community. So I'm really excited to join John Flavin and Dan Lyne talking to you today, and excited to kind of share what's been going on in our community and answer any questions.
The classic unmute. Dan, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. My name is Dan Lyne. I'm with CBRE. I focus on our biosciences work, not just in the region, but for our global client base. It's been something near and dear to me throughout my career. Unfortunately, which we'll probably talk about a little bit more here on the primary research and labs world, a lot of the supply just hasn't been in our market. While we've had a very sophisticated components on a number of areas, this hasn't been one we've traditionally been hitting. And fortunately now, we see a little bit more of a stride moving forward. And so excited to be here with John Flavin, who has been just a tremendous steward and leader in the life sciences arena for so many years in the Midwest, as well as John Conrad, who has really been lifting up and is just a beacon for biosciences, life sciences in general, for not only the larger corporations, but the smaller companies. And I think we want to really hone in on that component of new company formation and how that's really played a role into some of the dialogue we're having today.
And last, John Flavin.
Thanks so much, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here. Great opportunity to talk to this esteemed audience, and really happy to be joined by Dan and John. Looking forward to the conversation. I'm founder and CEO of Portal Innovations. We're very focused on building strong life sciences startups. We're partnered with Trammell Crow to build space in 2 buildings, one at West End at Fulton and Ogden, and one to come online in the first quarter of 2022, the enterprise known as Fulton Labs. And as Dan pointed out, it's a very important resource that's been lacking in our market. But in addition to needing space, my background is well suited to launch Portal to help kind of the next generation of companies get off the ground here in Chicago. I spent my career as an entrepreneur, an executive in the biotech field. I've built several companies here in Chicago, taking technologies out of universities and then ultimately building teams, building laboratories. Because there really wasn't this type of infrastructure available, many of the companies that I built we had to build on our own laboratories, culminating in a property in Woodridge on 14 acres, about 175,000 square feet of wet lab and office space that still exists today. So, I'm very tuned into the importance around not just this industry, and I'd like to talk about that today, but also the interrelationship and reliance around real estate, proximity to academic centers, proximity to talent, and also the right type of infrastructure. This is not the type of work that you can do, in your bathtub or in your garage at home. And so we'll talk a little bit about those features and some of the things that I experienced in building those companies and how we're trying to solve those problems here with Trammell Crow and the Fulton Labs project and Portal Innovations in particular.
Thanks. So everyone's given a little bit about their history and a walk back in the past. But before I ever have one of these conversations at any one of our job starts, we usually have the question of the day. So the question of the day is it brings everything from the past to the future. And that is, I'm going to ask each of the 3 a lighthearted question. And I'm going to ask the audience today, if you have any questions, please post them up on the chat board. I'll be checking it as we go along, and I'll try to work it into the questions. But the first question to all 3 of you is, what is the last song you sang out loud or sang in your head, probably today or yesterday? So John Flavin, what was the song that you had in your head or were singing in the shower this morning?
I was singing Sweet Home Chicago, actually, the Eric Clapton version.
All right. Dan?
Sugar E all day long.
All right. Now you guys are going to be patronizing me because you see the posters in the background, I think. And John Conrad, what did you have?
I think I was working out this morning. Pearl Jam was on heavy rotation, and Jeremy was pretty much stuck in my mind the rest of the morning. So
yeah, and the reason I asked that question is somehow I turned on the radio, real radio in Chicago, and they were playing Afternoon Delight, which is now stuck in my head all morning. All right, with that, we've been, and all of us here in Chicago, we're obviously in the middle of a pandemic, and related or unrelated, and we're going to ask this question at the very end, is this hot topic of life science space and growth. Tenant markets have been depleted, And it seems like a lot of people are talking about life science. And I think one of the topics that I hear a lot about, and we even talked about in this group, is what exactly is life science versus regular lab work. So John Conrad, I want to ask you, because you have a great from your organization defining what exactly is the life science industry.
Yeah, so life sciences and biosciences often get used interchangeably, and for the most part, it's exactly the same. It's really just a big bucket of industries that are all focused on improving human health and the quality of our life. So iBio, how we define life sciences is it encompasses companies in the fields of biotechnology, pharmaceuticals, biomedical technologies, medical devices and diagnostics, nutraceuticals, food processing companies, bio-focused environmental companies, and organizations and institutions that devote the majority of their efforts in the various stages of research, development, and technology transfer and commercialization in those kind of industries. So it's a big bucket of a number of industries, but all really kind of focus on improving human health and our quality of life using science. So,
and what's interesting is when we get most of these phone calls, and I know all of us have received them, when everyone's like, when they want to talk about a lab, they start confusing them. And obviously there's chemistry labs and physics labs, or we can go on to different product innovation labs. But John, I'm going to ask you, can you talk a little bit about, first of all, what are the primary differences when we're talking about a lab between the life science labs versus other type of labs? What's the differentiators, so people know?
Well, I know that, again, when we were building our companies, over the years, when we would say to a contractor here in Chicago or a real estate firm, we would say we're looking for lab space. And that usually connoted like a medical lab or a dental lab, which is not the laboratory that we need to access. And so if we focus in on what labs we're referring to that we need to essentially bring a new medicine to market or bring a new device to market, and increasingly, using new computing algorithms, doing those things sometimes remotely. That's kind of where the state of the art is. And so the space and the infrastructure that's needed is a blend of things. So when you think about your high school chemistry class, those labs are still required. You need fume hoods, and that requires specialized air intake equipment and units on the roof and CFMs and all that good stuff. You're going to be using chemicals, so you have to have the right chemical storage. You have to be compliant with the regulatory codes associated with the use of those chemicals. Increasingly, when you think about physical sciences and chemistry, I would say that's been the historical way that we've brought new medicines to market. In the last several years, the use of biology has become even more important. And that's why, again, as John points out, the name biosciences, using our understanding of the human genome, you hear terms thrown around like personalized medicine. Those scientists need biological laboratories. So they're doing cell and gene therapy type work. They're working with cell cultures, tissue cultures. Sometimes a vivarium is required to be able to use and test early stage on animals these medicines before they go into human clinical studies. So the range of needs for a laboratory, I'd say your best proxy to level set would be thinking about your environment that you had in high school chemistry, where you have bench tops, you've got equipment, and then you've got fume hoods and specialized rooms that support this type of work.
So I love the reference back to high school, because I've used that in the past as well. One of the questions that's come out, and as you can see, the biosciences, there is somewhat of a tie to healthcare, universities, and big business. John, could you kind of walk us through the relationship through those, from the healthcare industry to how it comes out of universities and big business? Where do each three of those play a role right now? And we'll talk about the development of a company as well.
Yeah, definitely. When you think about the drugs you're taking today, or the devices that are being used, by patients today, there's a really good chance that the technology was discovered by a professor in a laboratory at a university. And that's usually the genesis of a technology, a new drug, a new device, a new algorithm. The source of that innovation begins within the walls of academia. When the technology is discovered, it's really imperative for given the amount of investment that will be required to develop that technology in the hundreds of millions of dollars and over a 10-year, sometimes over a 10-year time horizon. That's when the technology gets, you put patents around it so you can protect the investment that's being made. That's a typical part of the process for how a technology emerges from that early innovator. And then typically venture capitalists and entrepreneurs get engaged in starting a company around that intellectual property to start moving that technology into animal studies and then ultimately into human clinical trials. Large companies get engaged when the technology has been de-risked, meaning you've taken that molecule or that device through initial human clinical studies, where a large company, Abbott, Pfizer, Merck, Gilead, want to acquire that technology or partner with that biotechnology company at that point in time. So that's the progression. The medicine makes it to the patient, kind of beginning with the professor, working through the hands of venture capitalists and early risk takers, into the hands of large companies that can ultimately have the power to distribute those medicines to those patients. But there's a really important continuum of relationships, almost like a relay race of getting, that stewarding that product from start to the market.
And John, I asked you that question because everything that's going on with the pandemic, we hear, everything about drug trials, we hear about what's happening in hospitals, and many of us, we just need to make sure we understand how that progression works. So we're going to continue to talk about that. When you mentioned, obviously, drug companies and biosciences, John Conrad, I want to ask you, can you set the tone of how big is the life science industry here in Illinois, the Midwest, and the United States? And let's start with that question. How is it here in Illinois?
Yeah, so Illinois, we are, by several metrics, a very large and growing life sciences kind of hub within the United States. So looking at the direct jobs, I talked about it, referenced it in my kind of introduction, but Illinois is home to 87,918 direct jobs in the life sciences, really located at, just over 3,000 kind of establishments. So when you look at the breakdown of that, really the pharmaceutical industry in Illinois is kind of the second highest concentration in the United States here. Primarily located up in the kind of Lake County area. iBio, when we reference our members, are really kind of focused on the pharmaceutical, medical device, and food nutrition industries. Of that kind of breakdown of that kind of overall life sciences bucket, you're kind of closer to 40,000 or 41,000 direct jobs in the life sciences or in those kind of industries. So 48% of that's in the pharmaceutical industry, 31% is in medical device, and 21% is in food and ag. When you look at our kind of states that are bordering us, Indiana is right around 50,000 life sciences jobs. Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, they all have pretty decent, about 30,000 to 40,000 direct life sciences jobs. When we look nationwide, where do we rank? We're really in the top kind of 5 kind of clusters within the US. Obviously, California with San Francisco and San Diego, which I would argue should be broken out, from themselves there, but they have just over 290,000 jobs in the life sciences. Massachusetts, Boston, Cambridge, just over 107,000. Texas is a state that is rapidly growing. A couple of years ago, they're the same size of us. Now they've just broken 100,000 direct life sciences jobs. And New York is another major hub, New York, Philly area, also with just over 88,000 life sciences jobs in both of those. So
when we're talking about the stuff we're talking about today, it's really about more focused on research in these growing companies. How are we fitting in those same markets in terms of the starting off point for growth?
Yeah, so our industry here in Illinois has really gone through kind of a big change over the past couple of years, and I think John Flavin can talk more about it on the kind of university perspective, just of his experience there at Polsky. But we traditionally have been home to large corporate headquarters of life sciences companies. You know, Searles were here, Abbott, Baxter, Astellas came here when Fujisawa merged with them. Takeda historically has been here. We've been home for these big companies, and our universities have really been focused on kind of the Lyrica big tech transfer model for a number of years. Now, that said, over the past 5 years, we've seen a big shift in our universities. They're focused on creating companies and creating kind of innovation hubs, mostly, you know, kind of highlighted by what John has done at Polsky Center before he moved on. So what we're seeing with our universities now is we are really in the top 10 kind of states for academic research institutions. Obviously, UIC, University of Illinois down in Champaign, Northwestern, University of Chicago are all major global recognized kind of research centers for the life sciences. We also have state labs like Argonne, which has been doing a lot on kind of the COVID front. We also have Fermilab here. So that really kind of pushes us up there in the kind of rankings for not only academic R&D, which I think our numbers in 2018 were around 1.6 billion in R&D funding, but also NIH funding coming into our state has been increasing and continues to increase. We also are a leading patent producer in the US, which is a strong indicator of innovation, and our venture investments within our state have been growing rapidly over the past couple of years. This is all signifying this kind of shift to this small company creation and really the kind of, I think, drive that we're seeing here for the need for spaces like we're going to talk about today.
So continuing, John, one of the questions is, are we in a chicken or egg scenario? Meaning, are we in a need for space because of what's coming out of our local universities? Or are universities, obviously, in some locations, growing demand because of the space that's available and companies have been set up? I mean, I've heard both talk about it, different parts of the country. So in Chicago, what's your take?
Well, I think first we should do a quick level set around kind of Chicago and its place in the national life sciences ecosystem. So all the stats that John laid out are well stated and well understood. You know, there's no question about it. You know, we've got a lot of density in the life sciences industry in Illinois. Having said that, the shift that John talked about, this early stage innovation, is a relatively new phenomenon for Chicago. And that's important because when you think about a Cambridge and Boston area, which I consider kind of ground zero for biotech, we have a lot of the same features and characteristics, but we're a much earlier stage. We're a much earlier stage in the cycle. So when you think about Cambridge, I think there's 25 million square feet of laboratory space there. They're all adjacent to each other. You have large pharmaceutical companies that have set up shop here. Many of the major venture capital firms that fund the early stage research coming out of the universities, you know, have their headquarters in this area. And so what I'm describing to you is a tightly packed, very dense ecosystem that exists centered around MIT and Harvard and many other universities in that area. So when you now come back to Chicago, we have a lot of those same raw ingredients. We've always had those raw ingredients. Great universities, great national labs, a smattering of larger companies in both med tech and in biotech and pharma. But it's a very new energy that has shifted the pendulum to very early stage companies. And a lot of this, I think, is triggered by the investments that the universities have made in the last 5 to 10 years in attracting the same faculty that otherwise would choose to go to an MIT, Stanford, or Harvard. They want them here in Chicago. And those faculty want to start companies around their ideas, and venture capitalists want to hang out with them, and they want to form companies with them. That's what's changed in our ecosystem. And so that is now driving demand, real demand for laboratory space, because if you don't have the laboratory space, those companies will form, but they're not forming here. They're forming and growing in a Boston or in a San Francisco. So I think that's the biggest shift that we're experiencing. And I would say that it's a market-driven activity and a response by universities for their own benefit, if they want to attract the best faculty, it's this type of faculty that wants to start a business, and they've invested heavily into recruiting those types of people into our ecosystem. They're now here, and now companies need to form, but there's nowhere to go.
Jeff, I think you're on mute.
Thank you.
There you go. You bet.
That's obviously how these companies are spinning off from the universities. What does this initial space look like? I mean, is it small? Is it how do you describe what they're typically looking for, so the audience has an idea of how big of a real estate impact this has even?
Well, I might kick it to Dan just to give kind of a panoramic, response to that, because I think then I can comment around, what do startups need and how will Portal Innovations support those types of startups? But it might be worth getting Dan's kind of big picture view on responding to that question, because it's part of a bigger equation.
It is, and I don't think it's, I think it's a fairly obvious answer, which is, it depends on which stage you're at in the science or the cycle of if in a case of a therapeutics, if you're trying to get it commercialized, where are you in that process, right? And so that could look anything like a couple benches in a small environment for you and a team. It could look like at a next stage. It could look like a more and I'm trying to speak in more of a real estate sizing, but it could look more like a private suite for a team in benching environments. Again, it could be in an environment like John is, which Portal is a lot more hands-on than what would be just a co-benching or a typical model that just had buy benching as you go, as those are evolving across the United States right now. Or it could be anything for just like any other typical user, which is, look, we need to have a full floor of this sophisticated infrastructure. I think the one thing that is also very much on par with it is like, it's not like you can take them at each stage of this and then say, hey, that's great. We'll have that for you in a year and a half. They need it now. And that's always been the case with Chicago. And I think there is this, when you put it in perspective, there is this more sense of heightened urgency now, because while these other markets are, 7, 8, 9, 10 years ahead of us in more sophisticated, densely aggregated life sciences markets like Boston and Cambridge or even South San Francisco, you're just going to continue to lose all of these gazelles at a very critical moment. And I would say that I might push into the universities a little bit. If you'll notice, the areas where it has happened in Boston, Cambridge, you have a specific, shingle that's been held out by the university and how that they've said we're open for business. And they're in the business of not just the primary research, but also growing and allowing companies to expand in and around their campuses. And that's a very critical element here that I'm not quite sure that we've had fundamentally, because I don't know that that was a primary mission statement of our universities. They've done, it's not to knock them. We have world-class universities here in Northwestern and University of Chicago. But I would say that you're getting a tremendous amount of push now when you see the loss of that innovation to where there isn't any infrastructure to support them around these universities to the coastal markets. That's been one thing. And then secondary, the boards of trustees that are surrounding these inventories are now getting much more active and kind of demanding this and saying, look, this is an industry that's mission-based, and nobody is not, there isn't one human being on this panel that's not touched by some aspect of a need for innovation in patient care. If you have a parent who has Alzheimer's, if you have a parent who has Parkinson's, or if you have a family member with an orphan disease or a rare disorder, this is the type of stuff that people are kind of, right now at this point in time, I think science and innovation is very elevated because of the pandemic. But the reality is these patient populations don't go away, and the need for innovation doesn't go away. And unfortunately, unless you have the space to be able to provide for that, whether it's inside the university setting or outside, you're still going to just lose it. And I think that's a critical component of how we've gotten to where we're at right now with the momentum that we're seeing in Chicago, which is extremely positive. But it's also one of the reasons we've been limited here in the past and lost some of these companies.
Dan, I wanted to ask you, just so we're clear, who's making this push from your eyes? Is it just the economy in the city of Chicago, or is it from the university, or is it from these investors? Who's leading it right now? When you say leading what? Are you asking who's leading the, well, I mean, you have, I mean, the largest, the largest influx in employment population in the United States right now is in biotech R&D. So, and moreover, you're seeing more investment in biotech R&D than ever before in United States history right now. So I think there's a pretty big push just from the markets in general. That's what I wanted you to clarify. The push is from the market. It's not coming, as you said earlier, the universities weren't necessarily asking for this, and just kind of a result of what the market is provided. Well, that's actually interesting. I would like to maybe go back from a time perspective, and John Flavin, I'm sure, can lean in here too, but you also have a very unique moment in time in 2003 when we, the final mapping and the Human Genome Project came together, right? And so that was really a seminal moment for the marriage of, mathematical and biological sciences to come together. And since that point in time, we have seen a tremendous amount of growth inside of the marriage of data sciences and biological and chemistry-based sciences moving forward in innovative spaces. This is an area from a market perspective that Chicago has a very unique advantage, right? A very significant draw of not just engineering talent from all of the Big Ten, but the Midwest in general, and global talent. It's spent a lot of time to be a global city, to attract all of that talent here. At the same time, we have to put it in context of how then does that translate into making sure that the premier team or microbiologist from South Singapore or the southern part of Singapore or South Korea has an open environment here and a welcome environment here to be able to capture that if you're a company, to be a talent magnet. And here we go back again in this kind of talent war. And I think that really becomes a lot of the story around the successful marketplaces, is how they've captured that density, but then also married that up with a very sophisticated engine to attract all that talent for the companies. And then you kind of have a perfect storm, right? You have this infrastructure that can support it in a world-class city at a time where the most capital, at least in Chicago, I know right now, the most capital in the United States, at least on a percentage increase basis in biotech and life sciences, is right here in Chicago. Now, that is a very big deal and a very different moment in time than we were many years ago in terms of our capital flow. And I would look back over to John and John, that really started to move the needle on new company formation, growth, that there was capital really started to get to work here in the region. So with those statements, obviously there's a movement, there's the push. Dan, would you mind speaking briefly on, would you talk about some of the life science spaces that we have around Chicago, whether it's online or the new ones that have been talked about? I think they're key, so people have a perspective of what it is. Sure. Yeah, sure. Well, as it turns out, while we have one of the most sophisticated real estate development communities arguably in the United States, this is just one area that our development and investor community has not really excelled at. And it's it's obviously very sophisticated infrastructure. And there are, a handful of developers around the country who have been ahead of this game by years, if not decades.
and really are supplying the lion's share of the product. And I think what it took was an outside developer like Trammell Crow to say, hey, look, we need to study this market and understand it. And we need to speak with the John Flavins and the John Conrads, because we know that we have the capacity to build this type of sophisticated infrastructure. The question is it the time, and why hasn't this been done here? And after a lot of time and effort spent, they realized this is one of those very rare moments where we had a market that was punching below its weight in a very extreme manner. And so their thesis was, we're going to come into Chicago, we're going to build a world-class facility and wrap a world-class development team of advisors and engineers around these products at both 1375 West Fulton, which is immediately being delivered to the market. It's the first Class A lab in Chicago in forever. And then their new build at 400 North Aberdeen, which is a lot of excitement around. I think the 5th floor is about to be up. But this is the first 700,000 square feet the city's seen. They're saying, look, we're going to put this in the market, but we're going to be the first movers. We're going to put this in an area that already, back to that thesis about attracting talent, already has proven that it can attract world-class science and engineering talent. And we're going to drop it right into Fulton Market. And this is where we've seen, and I think that they've seen a lot of that demand. Now, it's not a zero-sum game either. You have the suburban markets, which are very sophisticated, and back to John's point, have grown up. And I don't think you're seeing a zero-sum game. I think what you're seeing here is a lot of companies in a very stratified marketplace of therapeutics and med device saying, look, we can keep some of our office here, and if we're looking for lab to attract more talent, we can put some of it down there and keep it all within the region. So I don't think it's going to be just these big giant pile-ons. You are going to see a market wake up to the infrastructures available, and let's move forward and try to take advantage of it.
So obviously you're talking about the Trammell Crow project in the West Loop, but there's Sterling Bay that's looking at going to Lincoln Yards. There's the work at the University of Chicago. There's Roseland Franklin. Yeah. There's the Skokie Research Park. Tell me about what are the pros and cons of some of these other locations as well.
Again, I would say that it's a very frenemies type moment, because right now the city, from a Chicago perspective, it really just needs to prove itself out as a research hub, right? And I think that if you're any one of those other developers, they're all kind of looking and to see, hey, is this demand really there? And I think it's proving out that it is. But it's a very important thing, because it's not just going to be one place, one point in time. It's going to be many sizes of product. And I think that in the immediate, when you introduce something new to a market, you have to take out all of the elements that limit its success. And that's why, while there are great land plays in very multi-dimensional parts of the city, with the 78 and with Lincoln Yards, and also down on the Michael Reese site, those are extremely important assets for the city. And their success in the biotech region is only going to lift up all of the others in the biotech facility. And we see, and I want you to lean back into John Flavin maybe and John Conrad, the demand for this, you have to understand, Cambridge and Boston that's a 25 million square foot market. We are at, just over 1 million maybe. We are so far behind. We see a world in which Chicago catches up in rapid speed. And we see a world in which the infrastructure and the demand that's immediately already playing out continues to just have a cyclical effect on its own success.
So John Conrad, let me ask you a question on this then. Obviously, we're talking about Chicago. We just mentioned the surrounding areas. You represent the whole state and all the companies throughout the state. What are we doing, and are we seeing anything like that will take place around University of Illinois or other institutions in the Big Ten that will help feed Chicago's growth here, or does it deter from it?
In my opinion, it helps feed it. What we see, University of Illinois down in Champaign is a research powerhouse, right? They have great companies coming out of there. They have great companies that are growing down in their kind of lab and facilities they have down there. What we tend to see is as companies start to grow, they start to attract more employees and they start raising capital, they tend to move to Chicago for just that fact of attracting talent that's needed. And so that's what we're starting to see. We've seen companies move from Ohio to the Chicagoland area just for that reason. Another thing that we haven't talked about necessarily is that, as I said, we have this historic kind of bench of large biopharma companies. With that comes a big bench of top management. So when we look at successful companies over the past 3 to 5 years, they're headed by ex-Baxter executives, they're headed by ex-Abbott executives. So those executives are bringing companies to the state as well to build it because they want to build their own kind of company. So it feeds into it. And I think, getting back to something that Dan kind of said is if you look at the breadth of the life sciences industry, they're going to self-select what kind of lab space they're going to go into and where they're going to go. A company that is doing a pure kind of testing or research is not going to necessarily go into a Class A space. They may want to be in a Class B space because they want to look at that. They don't really have that kind of need. When you look at an innovative company that's trying to attract top talent, that's trying to attract investment, they're going to go into a space like Fulton Market because they want to be in some place where they can provide their employees with that work, play, live. In my opinion, also what sets Fulton Market apart and then the Fulton Labs apart is what John Flavin is bringing to it with Portal Innovations. So, we're talking about a physical infrastructure with that lab, but John's providing this kind of software piece, which is another major piece, this kind of acceleration piece that we didn't have in our community before. So I'm just going to take that kind of softball and throw it up in the air for John to continue.
Before you catch it, John, I want to make sure, John Conrad, you mentioned these leaders, these big companies are coming to Chicago. So I'm interpreting that as well as when the corporate headquarters will be moving to Chicago as well. And so that do each of you, or especially you, John Conrad, do you think that this is going to add to the corporate line as well as to the bioscience line of the Chicago business?
So I'm saying those corporate leaders are already here because they were working at Abbott and Baxter. And they're attracting additional talent. So we're seeing teams of these kind of corporate leaders starting up successful companies. Avexis is one of them. That was a big kind of win for our community where Sean Nolan coming out of Lundbeck had a team that came together of people that really kind of built that company and moved it on with its acquisition by Novartis. You have Norbert Riedel coming out of Baxter leading what was Norex and now is Aptonix. You had Tim Walbert coming out of Abbott that really built what is now a big company for our community here, which is Horizon. So you have that corporate leadership that's attracting additional kind of leadership into our community, and they're creating companies. It's kind of it's a little bit of a snowball effect there.
Okay, so. and that's what I wanted to get cleared up. Thank you. John Flavin, we're going to get to you here. But one last question here that was mentioned, and that is about the Class A office building. People aren't obviously moving into Class A office building, but you guys took that and built 1375, which was a Class A. Are there any types of buildings that are suited better for life sciences so that everyone understands what the choices are out there over others that currently exist? And why are we having to build new ones? And I will let Dan, you as the real estate end, kind of take that question.
Well, we have to build new ones because there's no supply. There actually, if you went out and, I have many tenant clients look for a 20,000 square foot of lab and there wasn't any for them. So the fact is that there was it's the desert out there. So now that being said, with that, you have the ability to kind of leapfrog. Traditionally, if you look at it from a redevelopment versus a Class A, it depends on where you are in the spectrum of your look, but side by side, I would say that because of the sophisticated air handling needs and where we are currently in the cycle of not just the office but just the lab market, scientists don't have the pleasure of remotely working in their lab, right? They have to be in their labs. The lab is a very critical component of moving any type of innovation forward. So So that's one reason why this market actually hasn't necessarily taken any time off. As a matter of fact, it's only accelerated forward, as we've seen. But I would say that if you put the product side by side of a redeveloped versus a Class A, 8 out of 10 times someone's going to choose that greater product. I wouldn't say while pricing moves the needle, I would say in Chicago certainly is going to benefit from its lower pricing than these dense coastal areas, and 100%. What moves the needle is the difference in how we're looking at new homes for scientists. And traditionally, what we've done is put science and laboratories off in some remote part of our city or an area where they look like they're in an industrial area.
Where there's
my mantra is, sorry, go John.
Where there's just apes, Jeff.
Right.
Yeah. And I would say, I probably broken record when I say this, but scientists are people too. And they like to go out and have a beer, and they're working 24 hours a day right now, or 25 hours a day, which prompts me to say, go hug a scientist when you see them next, your neighbor or your family member. But, they like the same amenities. And I think that when you see these new class of buildings that are being put up, those, not only do we not have lab here, but we're going to be seeing a leapfrog, because it's going to be more consistent with what global facilities look like to attract talent and be able to maintain the sophisticated infrastructure with all of the amenities, workout facilities and outdoor space that we're coming through at the end, not just that we were working through with office, but that we're going to come through at the end of this current pandemic cycle.
Yeah, Dan, we hear a lot about, who the employee is. The average age is 25 to 35, and they want to be in cool places. So I appreciate that insight. John, a lot of questions. I guess we punted on a couple. Any comments to what Dan and John Conrad have said in the last few before I come to you with a few more questions?
Yeah, no, I think just adding on what Dan said, I think that it's designing space to attract talent. And when we think about our market, we need to think about just like those universities that are trying to attract that top talent, they're pulling in from other markets, right? And the same thing here, an entrepreneur and a scientist have a choice as to where they go. They're national and very portable with where they're headed, especially in the age group you just cited. So they're not thinking about what's my price per square foot for this old building we just retrofit versus the Class A spot. They're thinking about where's the Class A spot in this country where I'm going to get the most support for my company. And so when you think about life sciences real estate, it's a more complex equation. It's about the ecosystem that it fits into. So, universities play a big part, venture capitalists play a big part, entrepreneurial talent, repeating entrepreneurs and managers like the ones that John Conrad mentioned, Jeff Aronin, Tim Walberg, Sean Nolan, they're all returning to the ecosystem. They're building their next company. And we want them to be doing that in Chicago. So we need to have the right tools and resources to do that. Just again, back to the big picture, record levels of venture capital funds being formed in life sciences, even accelerating through COVID because of the spotlight around the need for this, what is now, a vital security issue for the United States. I mean, the U.S. can't have, gap years anymore. And I think people are seeing how important it is within our country to invest heavily into life sciences, new therapeutics, new vaccines, anything related to it. These venture funds are raising record levels. The IPOs for biotech companies are off the charts, and they're being rewarded for innovation. And that innovation is solving important problems and curing patients and diseases in a manner that hasn't been seen before. And that's going to continue into the future. So you got venture capital driving it. You have, markets that are fully built out ecosystems that are more mature in nature, Boston, South San Francisco. But then you have the emergence of cities like Chicago that are over science, but underfunded and under infrastructured. And that's what's happening now. And that's where we're going here in the next 5 to 20 years. where we have a lot of upside. And Portal Innovations and fitting into that picture is recognizing that the early first step that faculty member needs to take, and the choices they have right now without this space and without Portal, their choice is to take $30 million in a Series A round and set up shop in Boston. Now that we have all those faculty here, that those investors are coming in and they're saying, I want to fund you, but I'm going to take you back home to do that. So what Portal is doing is, with space, with capital, with our management talent and our network, we're the bridge, and we're bridging and creating the ecosystem that Boston currently has, that San Francisco currently has, and recognizes that real estate for life sciences is not bricks and mortar. It's very important. It's got to be top grade. It's got to be class A, but that's the hardware. The software is who's there, what are they doing, where's the Nobel laureate, what does he feel about this space, what's the next paper coming out in Nature that's going to drive the next company that's going to raise $100 million in a Series A round and go public in 2 years. That's what's happening in life sciences right now. And Chicago has every right to participate in that, what's going on in this market. And that's going to run well into the future. And we do have a moment in time where Chicago has the opportunity to really rise its stature on the biotech scene.
Hey, John, so related to something you just said in a question that was posted, we are a world-class learning place. We're a world-class healthcare. How close right now is the relationship between the bedside relationship and the research organizations and the healthcare institutions? That's one of the questions that's out there right now from Doug King.
It's tight. I mean, again, this is a continuum. So, when you think about the faculty member that's discovering the new molecule, oftentimes they are a physician, they're practicing, they're treating cancer patients in the medical center at the University of Chicago. And they're using that knowledge to go back to the lab. Many of these folks are MD, PhDs that are not only treating patients, but they're doing research to figure out how to improve their patient care. So I would say the connection between research and practice is very tight. And I would say that the timeline, especially in these new technologies, you'll hear a lot about cell therapy, gene therapy. Again, this is all coming now on the heels of many years of work with, as Dan pointed out, the intersection of math, biology, and chemistry coming out of the Human Genome Projects. It's hitting now, and with the shortened timetable of going from discovery of the cell therapy to the patient is getting much shorter. So where it used to take 12 years to get a drug from idea to market, sometimes now in cell and gene therapy, it can go from discovery to the bedside in 3 to 5 years. So it's a much tighter packed continuum.
We're talking a lot about data. So another quick one for you, John. Do we have the infrastructure to support all this data that's flying around? And how big a component is that going to be talking about in the next few years to support this?
Well, at Fulton Labs, this is front and center. We want to attract that data sciences talent. We want to give them the best toys to work with, the best bandwidth. And so that will certainly be present and really on first of its kind design for our space at both Portal and pervasive through Fulton Labs. When you think about Chicago, it's really the world's leader in the computing infrastructure. When you think about high performance computing at Argonne, Fermilab, the announcement of the Chicago Quantum Exchange. So quantum is kind of the next frontier in applying these high-powered computing instruments and applying it to life sciences will be a big part of the future. Argonne just won a $1 billion grant to form a quantum center. So all the people that want to work with that platform and apply it to life sciences are aggregating in Chicago. So the hardware and the software, I would say that's where Chicago stands out amongst the national ecosystem. Boston isn't built that way. San Francisco isn't built that way. Austin isn't built that way. That's Chicago's game, really.
Okay. John Conrad, question for you that was asked earlier that was submitted. Briefly, what are any government restrictions or advantages do we have in Chicago? We know there's been a lot of talk from the governor about this that other areas don't have.
So the governor is very focused on building the life sciences industry. He sees it as a major growth industry for our state. It's part of his economic plan, 5-year economic plan for the state of Illinois, and he's been rolling out different pieces that are focused on helping to grow the industry. A major piece of that is the infrastructure piece, and the Department of Commerce and the governor's office are going to continue to kind of work on that. Funding, capital is another major piece. If we're talking about how do we make our state and our city here sticky for companies that are coming out of universities instead of going to the coasts, we need to make sure that we're providing access to early stage capital. So there's going to be a number of kind of tax credits and other kind of programs focused on that. R&D tax credit is another major piece that our state of Illinois has that helps promote the investment of research in our state. So these are key kind of tools that are pieces of a toolkit that our state has and will continue to kind of build out, because it is such a major piece for Illinois. It's a major, not only do we already have a large kind of industry, but it's a major economic driver for the state. I think that's over 80 billion in economic benefit for the state of Illinois. So I think we're going to continue to see kind of support from our state in the growth of this industry. And that's a major part of what iBio does, is to help kind of bring that voice down to Springfield and to DC and kind of advocate to push that, because we need to make sure that our researchers are getting funding from the state and from the federal government to, create new companies out of the research they're doing. There's specific kind of grant programs that are focused on that. So that's one thing that we're focused on, and I know that the governor's office in the state of Illinois is focused on.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap this up. It's been a great conversation, but I want to ask each of you, few words, handful of words. What is the number one thing that's going to influence this growth starting now and in the future? So Dan, I'll start with you. What's the number one thing that is going to influence how successful this is going to be in Chicago?
There isn't one thing, but I would like to get on a little soapbox. For some reason, and I'm not quite sure why, Chicago media has not celebrated science and innovators in the scientific field the same way they have as the person who invented the coolest dating app. And I'd like to see, and I think that's going to be a big accelerator, when we start to see more stories about companies of names you have never heard of. And by the way, the company, like Avexis is now, Novartis Gene Therapies, that was one of the largest acquisitions in Chicago in decades, and probably very few people on this thread right now could tell you who that was. So celebrating and highlighting stories like Portal and all the companies that are going to be coming out of there, getting those innovators to have more visibility, I think that is going to really help leapfrog us, because it's happening. A lot of people just don't know it's happening.
Yeah, well, Dan, I'm getting messages from people in the crowd, and I think everyone loves your "Go Hug a Scientist." As the father of someone whose kids are going to be scientists, I love that approach. So thank you for that. John Flavin, what's your growth thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, at the end of the day, it's all about the patient, and I think that's where Chicago also stands out. We've got patient-facing creds on a world-class stage with regards to our world-class medical centers, and then working backwards from that, it's going to be all about creating an environment that attracts the best and the brightest in those core areas of data sciences, medical devices, and therapeutics, knowing that all of them are converging, and that's all science driven. And we want to create an environment that puts our arms around the scientists and those that support them. And I think if you're doing that, there's 3 core functional things that they're all going to need when they arrive, or in retaining them to the ecosystem. Again, think about, there's going to be names of the future, like Dan said, that people don't know about right now. John Rogers at Northwestern, the guy's a rock star. Chad Merkin, Rick Silverman at Northwestern, Tom Gajewski, University of Chicago, Kathy Nagler. These are going to be names that I think will become more well-known. If you're in Boston, everybody knows who Phil Sharp is. All right, everybody knows who the Nobel laureates are. I think those are going to be driving factors for what Chicago looks like. as we move forward with success. But you need three key things. You need lab space with the right infrastructure and equipment. You need management talent. And what you need in addition to that is the appropriate capital base to be able to fuel the development of these technologies.
Thanks, John. Last one, John Conrad.
Dan and John really summed it up very well. I'm gonna borrow on Dan and just kind of say, look at the time that we're living in, and look at the impact that this industry can have on patients and on our economy. Life sciences industry is leading the kind of fight against the pandemic. You know, our companies, the amount of time that we've created a vaccine and bring it to market is unheard of, right? It's been pushed through fast, but the science and the technology is there. It exists in our state to help make it happen. And on the testing side, the leadership coming out of Abbott is important as well. And when we're talking about the continuum and the need for space, there are currently 700 compounds in clinical production to focus on COVID. 80% of those came from a small company or a research lab. And that really highlights the importance of building out space like we're talking about today, because this is where the innovation comes from, is the size of companies that are going to be going into this space. And so I think, as Dan said, we need to really start to celebrate it more here in our state. And it's something that we need to see, because following that will be the investment, following that will be continued kind of focus on our community. So.
All right. Well, thank you, all three of you, for your time. Obviously,
Thank you.
Very, very important subject right now. And I got a feeling this group will be back 6 months or 8 months from now with updates of where it's going, because I think the market is going to continue to grow. So I think that's it from our end,
Thanks,
unless there's anything else from CoreNet.
Nope. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate your participation on today's event. We're glad to bring this content to you. Thanks the moderator and panelists for the great discussion today. I know we could have gone another hour easily, but really fascinating discussion, and everybody have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks, Patrick. Thanks, Jeff.